Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network.
Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over.
Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you'd get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. This is our weekly 2 cents segment. We're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast. And in our 2 cents segment, we take a plain English look at the big 3 property news stories of the week. I'm joined by Chris Bates. Chris, welcome. How's your week been?
Been well, Pete. Unlucky on the Ashes again there, mate. 2-0.
That didn't take long.
Yeah. No, I'm going to put it in there. I'm an Aussie today. If we lost, I probably would have just thrown my UK passport. Now, things have been good here. Just went up to Newcastle, where I grew up on the weekend to get a bit of help with the family and see some friends, which was good. What have you been up to yourself?
Well, our team's been busy this week buying a family home for a couple buying in Brisbane. So a nice home purchase on a double block. It was due to go to auction, and with some skillful buyers agency work, got it bought prior to auction. So everyone's very pleased with that. And otherwise, yes, trying to disregard all the news stories on the cricket and who may or may not have been playing outside the spirits of the game. So the next test match is straight away kicking off in the next day or two. So there's no respite. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, and there's so many stories we could talk about today. You kindly sent through about 8 different stories and we picked 3 out of them. So there's lots to cover. What are we doing this week, Pete?
Yeah, so look, there's always more than we could ever cover. Every Sunday morning at 7 a.m, you'll get your 2 cents podcast episode in your favorite podcast player. So this week, 3 news stories. One we picked up from the Fin Review. Tree changes returning to the cities, at least for some of the week. So that's our first story. Secondly, first home buyer assistance in Sydney and New South Wales. So from 1 July, big rule change under the new New South Wales Labor government. So we'll talk about what the changes are and what that actually means for buyers and what it means for the market. And thirdly, an exodus of real estate agents from the market. So during the boom period, it's a pretty cyclical industry. A lot of people got into real estate, bought the sharp suits and flash hire cars, but now leaving the industry again as things cool off and sales volumes drop back towards average and below. So those are our 3 stories. So we'll take a look at what's happening and why and what it means for the market. So Chris, let's start with the tree changes article. So this was an article, it was one of the little profile pieces in the AFR. Kate Bakos was the buyer's agent, good friend of ours and friend of the show. So basically there was an inner city unit, 3-bedroom apartment, I think, just looking at it. And I think the interesting thing, just running through the story, is that Kate's saying there that over the past decade, she hasn't really done much in that inner city unit market, but in the past 24 months, she's done more than the whole of the preceding decade combined. So, and in this particular case, the buyer is still working and living remotely in a tree change region, but wanted to have an inner city presence because I guess a lot of employers are now requiring that people are in the office maybe 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And a bit of a hybrid model emerging there potentially.
Yeah, I think this is a story we keep tracking. The whole work from home, remote work, hybrid work. What do employers do? What do unions do? Is an interesting change I've seen recently. There's a fight for people going through their unions to fight back with CBA. That was the story I read. So I do think this whole tree change, is only going to be what's really going to drive the market isn't sort of the downsizer market moving there. That's always, potentially move to these locations. It's really when the younger demographic, people working and taking their city incomes down to these regional locations and basically out competing local buyers and competing on a small number of properties. And ultimately, because there's true scarcity in these locations, I mean, they can always build house and land packages, but in the real pockets around the couple of beaches, there's only a number of houses. And so for growth to continue, though, you still need those Sydney families, or Melbourne or Brisbane families, for example, escaping the city but keeping their city jobs. And we're seeing a real retreat. Very few clients are making these big lifestyle moves. Whether it's either going in Sydney, for example, going to the Central Coast or north of Wollongong. That's not coming up that often right now, let alone when people go the next distance, right? Like to the Newcastles or the Kiamas or even further south than that. We're also seeing not that many clients looking at the big interstate move as well. In 2015, 16, 17, we saw a lot of clients go north, from Sydney to Brisbane. We also saw that in 2020, 2021, even 2022. But I think it's sort of slowed down a little bit over the last 6 to 12 months. So I think the interesting story is if you are a downsizer sort of, maybe in your 50s, you've got your kids have grown up and you make this tree change. I think you can do that city pad, we've got clients in this situation who've, a good friend of mine, actually, he's got a house up on the beaches where I am, and he's got a city pad in Alexandria. He goes to Alexandria during the week to work, and then on the weekends, he's up on the beaches. He's a bit older. He's in his 50s, for example. All the kids have grown up. So I think that really works. I'm not sure if it really what families want to sign up for. One, moving to this regional location, and then if one of the parties has to be away for 2-3 nights a week into a city pad, and leaving the kids and the pressure on the other partner. And I just don't know if that's going to float if it's 3 or 4 days in the office for most families. I think it really needs to be almost a fortnightly or a once a week visit where you're up and back, not a true hybrid model where you're leaving your family every week.
I think it's a stage of life thing, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah.
I remember growing up, my dad, who was in a career where he was constantly moving locations, and he used to work away for weeks on end, months on end. It absolutely sucked for him and for us. And I think, yes, I mean, if you're a single 20-something, then, crashing in the city a couple of nights a week is great. And likewise, if the kids have flown the nest, then you might choose to do that. I think for a lot of families, though, it looks better on paper than it actually is in practice to be away 2 or 3 nights. I do think the downsizing trend will continue over time. I think if nothing else, state governments and federal governments will actually put incentives in place to try and encourage people to downsize, because it will make a more efficient use of the housing stock. But yes, this is just an ongoing tug of war, isn't it, between employers and employees. I noticed one of the major banks, the employees are not happy at all about being demanded to go back into the office. And at the moment, anyway, the employees still have the upper hand because we've got very low unemployment. But that could well change in the next year or two. So fascinating thing that's sort of just unfolding, I guess. And we'll see whether people can sustain the hybrid model. I see SQM Research reported their asking prices for the past month. Regional asking prices just down a couple of % over the past month. Sunshine Coast, Mornington Peninsula. So clearly some of those lifestyle regions where prices went ballistic during the pandemic, that's now reversing. I mean, we've actually been seeing that for quite a while. It's just only now starting to show up in the figures, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who have moved to the regions pre-boom have finally seen a lot of growth, and maybe they haven't got as much in the super as they think they need. And there's been a bit of a temptation for the people who did downsize to these regions to then downsize again, especially if they don't need to be in these tier 1 regions that are commutable, and take advantage of the young families move in. I think that's what's, you get a little bit of that listings problem there, I think, in these regions versus in the capital cities where people aren't selling, for example, because they've got somewhere to live for the next 15, 20 years to get kids through schooling. And so I think that's one of the challenges in the regions right now is if sellers feel like they can get still a decent price, there's a temptation to get out because that money means a lot to them to downsize. The whole downsizing thing, we don't do too many clients in their sort of 50s, 60s. Given what we do, we have a lot of first home buyers, upgraders, people doing renos, investors, etc., in their 30s, 40s. But, I did a lot of work in this space in my first 5-6 years of advice in that pre-retiree. And a lot of that sort of cohort are very unsure around where they're going to live long term. Very few of them ever, when I ask those questions, have those, because they're always like, well, I'm not sure what's going to happen with the kids. I don't know where they're going to live. And we're just going to stay here for 5 years and we'll decide when we retire. And it was very hard to lock in a future plan with them. And I think a lot of it comes to where the children end up. And if you've got multiple children, do they spread out around the world, or do they all stay in, the capital city? And, when they're potentially having grandkids, they don't want to be too far away. So the downsides are they do want to move a little bit out of the city into a bit more of the country life, but then they don't want to move too far where they can't come and see the grandkids. And so it's a really interesting demographic to sort of watch and how this plays out, because it's for the capital cities. If we go back to that rule in the office a lot more than people expect, then you're going to get this pressure cooker build on inner ring properties where there's scarcity and people really prioritize their commute and time savings. Or do we go back to a real flexible model like we had in COVID, where it's 1 or 2 days in the city? That tug of war's got a long way to go, I think, Pete. And let's see how this plays out.
Yeah, the only thing I've really just observed is just in the evenings, the CBDs and the cities are packed, especially in Melbourne and Sydney, just probably as busy as I've ever seen them. But during the day, particularly on some days of the week, like Friday, just much quieter in the office. And actually some industry funds have had to write down the value of their office space over recent months, something that's been threatened for quite a long time. So as usual, we'll keep tracking what's happening in that area. So second story of the week, Chris, then first home buyer assistance in New South Wales. So firstly, what's happening? So the New South Wales Labor government is making a switch. So the previous government went down this route of allowing for first home buyers to opt out of stamp duty in favour of an annual land tax. Well, we've kind of gone back to a more traditional exemption approach. So basically, first home buyers from 1 July 2023, an exemption from stamp duty up to $800,000 purchase price and a concessional rate of stamp duty up to $1 million. There's also exemptions and concessional rates on vacant land at $350,000 and $450,000 respectively is the word I was grappling for. So yeah, I can't really wrap my head around why we've gone down this route. Everyone was pushing for a land tax as kind of the progressive approach. Almost all economists were agreeing that was the way we needed to move. And then we got a change of government. We've gone straight back to first home buyer assistance and stamp duty exemptions and back to how things were. So is it just politics, Chris?
Well, I think in this situation it is. The Libs were the ones pushing for the land tax, and the Labor pretty much straight away. Their argument was a bit silly, I thought. They were saying we don't want to sign up our first home buyers for a life tax, right? A tax they're going to continue to pay for the rest of their life. First home buyers don't keep their first property forever. They keep it for maybe 3 to 10 years. Their first property is not their forever property. It's a stepping stone property. And so they're not signing up to a land tax forever. They're only signing up for 3 to 10 years, and then they're going to go and upgrade into something else. That's just the reality of what first home buyers do. So the argument that, they don't want them signing up to a life tax was a bit, didn't really work in my view. But ultimately, I think this change is quite important, because what we've seen is a lot of the people who, young couples, two professional couples, we do a lot in obviously New South Wales. Typically, they probably, if they were doing quite well financially on an income point of view, they would potentially try to get him into a smaller house. So they might go for a 2-bed house in the inner west, or or maybe they look down towards the Shire, and they're probably looking at 1.5 to 2 range, which are big numbers, right? This is, but this is what absolutely were happening pre-2020, 2021. But in 2022, 2023, their borrowing capacities and their appetite to stretch have also reduced dramatically, right? Because interest rates are higher. First-time buyers are always naturally a little bit nervous entering the market, which is fair enough. It's very daunting. And they don't really want to stretch into that 1.5 to 2, A, because they can't find anything. There's very little stock. And B, they're just like, I don't rather than get a really poor asset in that range, I might as well just get something in that 1 to 1.5 range. So we're seeing that buyer actually reduce their budgets and buy well within their means. So we're creating a lot of competition in that 1 to 1.5 range. And I think that's something similar what's happening. If someone was looking in that 1 million to sort of, 1.1 range, they're tempted to actually reduce their budget down to 8 to 900. where they pay very little amount of stamp duty, and also they want to be conservative under higher rates. And so we've already seen a lot of clients that were trying to take advantage of that under $1.5 million stamp duty exemption that was up to, the 1st of July. But a lot of those people who didn't buy are still in the market. They've just have to now pay stamp duty. And so that policy in itself created demand that stuck around. It's sticky demand. So a lot of people who, they got tempted because they knew they didn't have to pay stamp duty. They've got their savings together. They got pre-approved. Now they're just readjusting their budgets to what they can afford because they've got to pay stamp duty. And so I think it was a very demand boosting policy. And I think there's going to be a lot of competition in that 800 to 900 million range for, often 2-bed apartments that are in Sydney and older blocks around the city. It's there's going to be a lot of buyers out there. And, the best time to sell that $1.1 to $1.5 million property in Sydney was probably pre-30 June. We saw a lot of properties go way over what they were worth because the first-time buyers in their mind thought, if I don't buy now, I'm not going to be able to buy post 1 July. And properties that should have sold at 1.3, 1.4 were selling at 1.5 on the nose, which was the limit. So, if you are in New South Wales and you haven't bought a property before, suss it out. The real benefits in the 800 to 900 range. Once you start getting 950 or 975, the stamp duty savings, quite minimal, and hence why I think a lot more demand will be in that 800 to 900 range.
Or people buying for $800,000 on the nose and then paying $10,000 for a set of blinds or something. So distortions in the market for sure. I think yes, it's always confusing to me. Australian politics. When I was growing up in the UK, it was really simple. You had the Conservative Party for business and you had the Labour Party for the trade unions, and there was no sort of middle ground. But in Australia, it seems like often one side of politics will just do the exact opposite, almost just because, they're the opposition. And we saw the same thing with carbon offsets. It was hard to work out who was the centre left and who was the centre right. There was so much crossover there. And at the moment, we've got a Labour federal government running the highest population growth in Australia's history. So not good for Labour, you would think, as in the Labour force. But yes, it's just the way these things seem to go. Now, you mentioned there, Chris, for first home buyers. And I know we've talked on a previous episode about lending still being way tighter than it was maybe a decade ago, or particularly pre-GFC. So it's tough for first home buyers who don't necessarily have high incomes if they can only borrow, 4 or 4.5 times their income. Now, I did see just a little bit of movements on the margin anyway this week. So one of the non-banks dropping its serviceability buffer down from 3% to 2%. So these are not deposit-taking institutions that are regulated by APRA. These are sort of non-bank lenders. And also, in some cases, potentially not even using buffers if you're looking at a 5-year fixed rate mortgage. So do you think we're going to see some shift in that direction from non-bank lenders? And I guess for the sort of regulated banks, probably nothing's going to change until we're pretty sure that interest rates have actually peaked or very close to peaking.
Yeah, so went back in the boom time. There was a lot of non-banks were offering very good rates. Because funding was really, and I'm saying the recent boom, 2020, 2021, offering amazing rates, just as good as the majors, to be honest, which is usually rare. Sometimes even cheaper. It was crazy how cheap they were. And their lending conditions were more relaxed in terms of they would lend more. But, going back in time, there's been times when that seesaw was flipped and it's become really hard for non-banks to get finance. And we also saw an explosion in new digital lenders that got cheap finance as well, right? But we know that when times get tough, they get smashed. And in recent times, what happens is that the rates on them jump up a lot and you become mortgage prisoners in a bank that you can't refinance out of. And there's a lot of brokers and a lot of clients, especially in the investor space, that have leveraged beyond what they could get at the majors, and they've gone into the non-banks with the idea that they'll refinance out within 6 to 12 months, and then the market flipped. And these clients are on rates that could be 1 or 2% above where the majors are, so they could be on 6.5%, 7.5%. Those banks aren't budging. They're not giving better rates to their customers, and the customers can't refinance out of them because they're A, because of equity prices have gone down, but also B, because their borrowing capacities have fallen. So all the way through the boom, we did under 1% of our loans with non-banks. We're very hesitant to use them. However, in recent times, we've also had to give clients other options, and non-banks, especially when you look at 5-year fixed, places like First Mat, Resimac, and all this sort of stuff, then your borrowing capacity jumps up a lot, potentially, if it's the right fit for you. And I do think there's going to be not so much the rate-driven benefit, but more borrowing capacity. And that client's going, I'm going to go to this non-bank. Yes, I'm taking on that risk that rates could be higher, but that allows me to get a better asset. And I'm hopeful that my income's going to go up a lot. I'm going to be able to refinance out back to the majors. And while that's a risk we need to think through, I do think there's going to be a bit of a benefit going to non-banks, especially when they do things like you say, Pete, reduce serviceability buffers. I don't know if that makes a huge difference, that 1%. Non-banks usually a bit higher on rate. So once you add in the higher rate, plus it might not be too much of an extra borrowing capacity than the majors. But I do think this serviceability is a real issue, because that we have absolutely got clients who, when we do the numbers, what they can borrow based on their income basically is not enough to buy anything quality, and they're just saying, I'm gonna do nothing, basically, just keep saving. And so it is forcing people out of the market, because it's just not enough capacity to do what they need to do, and they're just going to focus on improving their income and just building their savings and other investing.
I was wondering, because you said last week that today's headwinds could become tomorrow's tailwinds when things change, but yes, you've explained well there why, at the moment anyway, these are only small moves and it could be some way off. Reserve Bank of Australia kept interest rates on hold this month, as you'd have seen in the media this week. It was all over the place, actually.
Yeah.
I think that's what they would call a hawkish hold. So still potentially interest rates could go higher, but pausing to take stock of the situation, potential change of governor coming up as well. I think what people are, they're hopeful that we're nearer the peak for interest rates. Housing finance or lending seems to have found a base and is rebounding a bit, including for new investors. And of course, we're just not building very much. It's particularly in the inner cities now, which is itself underpinning the market. So but it does feel like there's going to be that 3% buffer is apparently going to stay in place until interest rates have definitely peaked or definitively peaked for the cycle. So we'll have to wait probably another 6 months or maybe longer before there's any change there. So, Chris, the third and final story of the week, exodus of real estate agents. So I had to go do a bit of digging to find out how many real estate agents there are in Australia. Bit of a movable feast because it's such a cyclical industry. 2021, just over 133,000 Aussies through a network of 46,000 real estate businesses. But I think that kind of underplays the importance of the industry in a way, because yes, there are 133,000 agents, but what about things like property management and rental collection? Then you've got all of the stuff that goes on in terms of renovations and furnishings and construction. I mean, if you look at it in that sense, it's 25% of the whole economy, So yes, real estate agents are just one part of, one cog in the wheel. Anyway, the news story was News have done a couple of pieces on this recently. Tom Panos, top auctioneer and agent in Sydney, he said that the exodus of real estate agents has begun. So a lot of agents got into the market in the boom 2020, 2021, 22, bought themselves a nice tailored suit, upgraded or leased a flash car, but now they're starting to leave the industry again. So I think the barriers to entry, Chris, in real estate are relatively low. It's quite easy to become a fully licensed agent, and therefore the numbers can be pretty up and down through the cycle. And I guess what this is reflecting is that sales volumes went really high for a period when interest rates fell to zero, but now they've fallen back to average in the capital cities, and in fact in regional Australia now below the 5-year average. And actually stock listed for sale, CoreLogic said, is now 26.4% lower than the 5-year average in the capital city. So it looks like the commissions for real estate agents are going to drop away now.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point around the cog in the wheel, because, mortgage brokers are part of that. Anyone who benefits from transactions, right? So transactions, mortgage brokers part of that, the person styling the property, the person who tidies the property up, the plumber, the electrician, for sale, the agent, the conveyancer, the building and pest guy, there's so many people who are part of that transaction. And if transactions really fall down, and there's a lot less work for a lot of people, in particular, people who have entered the industry in recent times, which already do it tough. I think the broking industry is going through this at the moment. We saw broker numbers, don't quote me on this, probably from 16 to 19,000, so a 20% increase in brokers. And whether they stick around, there's already a huge cohort of that 16,000 that are basically legacy and part-time brokers, or not brokers at all, just sitting on trail books, etc. So I think there's the 80-20 rule, but I would say in the real estate game, it's probably 90-10. It's really hard industry to crack. They've got the king and the queens of the suburbs, right? The ones that have been in that area for 15, 20 years, own the suburb. Everyone knows that they're the key agent. They sell 80-90% of the properties, or maybe it's two agents that sell 80-90% of the properties in the suburb. And then you have a couple of brands that pick up the odd sale, usually the poorer properties, the ones that maybe the seller goes to them because they're hungry and they're ready, and they do a really good pitch, and maybe they're a bit cheaper. And so I think it's a real tough game. And at times like now, absolutely, I think even the top agents would say it's tough finding new properties to sell, and also selling them. They're actually finding a lot of vendors are pulling properties. They get the listing, they show people through the property. That agents always potentially overpromise for the listing as well. The seller usually goes with the agent who tells them the biggest price, not the agent who's more real with them. And so if the agent can't get the price they overpromised, which is the reality in this market, especially if it's not a great property, the vendor says, I'm just going to sit and hold. If you can't get me 1.5 million, I'm just going to stay here. So agent does all this work for no money. And so it's a tough time. But, you've got to remember, though, that at times when it's booming, though, there's listings selling in hours, and there's potentially very limited work. Sometimes it's just matching two people together. So, it's just the natural cycles for lots of industry. And brokers are going through this as well. We're probably 15, 20% down. In particular, we're more affected than other brokers because we do a lot of the home buyers above $1 million. And that's absolutely the market that's seized up. The interesting thing here, Pete, I do think there's a lot of investors who are considering bailing. And one, because they can still sell their investments for fair prices because there's a lack of stock. So they're not having to do fire sale prices. Two, they're just under enormous pressure with interest rates. If you think you're paying 6.5% or % on your mortgage, and maybe your loan's moving from interest only to principal and interest, or even it's just interest only, and you're getting a 3% yield, you're losing 3.5-4%. And if you've got $1 million property, this could be $30,000 or $40,000 a year. You could be down. And clients who have got multiple millions of dollars in property, it's a real big cash flow burn, and they can't refinance, etc. And so we're absolutely seeing lots of clients come to us with 2, 3, 4, 5 properties. It's not a case of should I buy more? It's how many should I sell? And I think that's going to really, most of those properties, I think they're going to go to other home buyers. We could already see that there's more of a home buyer in the market than investors, I would say. And that's going to cause rental stress. But I think it's good if you're an agent in an area where there's lots of investors. So if you think high density apartments, you think where a lot of what we call property spruikers go to low, cheaper areas and where it's easier to buy, I think you're going to find with a lot of cohort of investors, I think you're going to find there. So yeah, I think some agents are going to find it really tough. Home buyer markets in capital cities where lack of listings and everyone's sitting on their hand. But where investor markets, I think those agents are probably going to do all right over the next 6 to 12 months because they're probably going to be targeting these investors that have basically can't hold on.
Certainly a bit less competition around when you're actually trying to buy property. I think the challenge is that sometimes if you get a quality property, good family home, good location, suddenly there's loads of interest. But I think for a lot of investor stock, there probably isn't so much competition around. I saw SQM Research runs a new distressed listings data series, and distressed listings went pretty high in 2021. A lot of people didn't have work for a period of time. Now we've got low unemployment, got very low vacancy rates, and the number of distressed sales has come down. So I think, yes, a lot of investors might be offloading properties, but not in a distressed or fire sale way at the moment anyway. It just seems to be people just reallocating their cash flows or reprioritizing a bit. But I think this is how the economic cycle works. I always refer back to a friend of mine, James Whelan, says this is how the whole economy really works. The bedrock of the economy is young people hooking up, buying a new home, furnishing it, white goods, spending. That is really what he calls the theory of stuff. The economy runs on people buying, building new homes, furnishing them, and then spending once they've hooked up as a couple on two incomes. And at the moment, I think we're starting to see the reverse of that. So we do know that residential construction in particular has a very strong multiplier effect. For every dollar that's spent in that sector, it kind of multiplies out to $3 across the wider economy. But we're going to start to see that going into reverse over the next year or two. And I suppose in the end, that's how the monetary policy works: tighter interest rates, tighter lending. It's just starting to cool off all of the excesses that we saw during that little boom period.
Yeah, you even make it exactly back to that cog in the wheel, right? What you've actually purchased, it's usually things you want to fix up to the property. You want to replace some blinds, you want to paint it, you want to get some floor in, and then you want to furnish it, and then you get your new TV and you get your furniture, etc. So those transactions, you're right, they just keep going on, and new money's basically replacing old money there into a suburb, and then cafes open up because more people are moving there and places gentrify, etc. So I think also in the construction sector, massive reduction in approvals, but approvals are basically money and the government's a big part of this as well. Stamp duty is a huge thing to not forget, right? And how much money that flows into other projects, etc. So this is one of the reasons why the land tax move is so enticing for the state governments, is because if you create more transactions, then you create a lot more economic activity. And that's really what they're trying to do with that land tax, I believe, is more transactions, create more activity, more economic benefit. They may not make as much money on stamp duty, but there's a lot of other benefits as the economy. And the new build construction world, the governments make so much money on that from taxes in lots of different ways. Lots of reports out on how much money the government makes on every new property. It's enormous. So it's been a big week, Pete. What should we chat about next week?
Well, get rid of the stamp duty and people can more easily move to where they need to work. It's good for the mobility of the labour force. And I guess the land tax would be a much more consistent revenue stream through the cycle instead of these enormous up and down lumps that we get with stamp duty. Firstly, let's summarise this week. So tree changes returning to the cities, at least for some of the week. First home buyer assistance in New South Wales comes into effect from 1 July. So if you're buying a property with a contract dated 1 July or later, make sure you check out what you may or may not qualify for. If you're not sure, just drop us a line, get in contact. We can point you in the right direction. And thirdly, an exodus of real estate agents from the market. It's a notoriously fickle and cyclical industry. But some of the Johnny-come-latelys are now going back to work in retail, hospitality, personal training, wherever they previously may have been working, I guess. So, so look, next week, Chris, there's always loads to talk about. I think it would be good to do a bit of a deep dive on some of the stock on the market. What is selling, what's being listed, what isn't selling, who's selling it. I think it'd be good to get into some of the nitty gritty and the detail on that, because a lot of these sort of macro figures you see reported, they don't tell the full story. And it'd be good to get some case studies and insights there.
I think you're right. I think CoreLogic have just released their monthly update. I think their chart pack will probably come out in the next week or so. We can also look at SQM. They've got good data around what's been sitting on the market for a while. Because I think this RBA indecision there, where it's, do we go up? Do we go down? Do we hold? Do we go up? I mean, that's probably not going down yet, but I don't think it'll be long before those conversations start to pop up, to be honest. But I mean, that just uncertainty is very heavily linked to new listings. As soon as the RBA flipped their sort of story, I think it was April or May, I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was May. Then I think that was a real, I'm not going to sell now. And I think agents would have just went, oh no. I actually thought markets were going to start to stabilize a little bit and I could actually encourage sellers into the market. But our sellers are like, I just want to see what happens with the RBA. I just want to see how high rates go before I make any of these big moves. And I think we're going to see this spring is going to be pretty disastrous, I would say, in terms of new listings. But we'll have a good chat about that next week on 2 cents.
Yeah, a bit can change between now and then, so we'll see. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. We always encourage you to send us your property questions via the link in the show notes, or even if you just want to connect or say good day. You can catch me on my daily blog, Pete Wargent Blogspot, or at Pete Wargent on Twitter. You can subscribe for the Rask podcasts on your favourite podcast player, and you can catch us on YouTube. And Chris, if people want to have a chat with you guys over at Blusk, where can they get in contact?
In the show notes, click the link. There's a bit of a type form there, and absolutely, we'll get in touch with you straight away. And absolutely sign up to Pete's blog, the best property blog in the country. Religiously read that every day. So thanks for putting that out, Pete. And I hope you have a good week, and happy Sunday to all our listeners.
Cheers, Chris, and let's go Poms.